Hello, and welcome to City in Crisis, Aurora and the Spanish Influenza Second Wave. I am your narrator, Krista Danis, and this presentation was created and compiled by Rob Winder, local history and genealogy librarian at the Aurora Public Library. In the early days of November 1918, it was apparent that the war in Europe was winding to a close. With the smell of victory in the air, Aurorans were ready to celebrate, especially, one would assume, after being confined at home by the quarantine. 3 days after the ban was lifted. On Thursday, November 7th, rumors of imminent peace were flying around, and, quote, Aurora opened the throttle and took the monkey wrench off from everything that would make a noise when the peace rumors would not die down. People gathered in the streets despite the beacon's assurance that the news from Washington contradicted the story. Even so, quote, every shop and factory in the city closed, and the workers paraded the streets in the rain for hours. Men, women, and children were seen among the paraders. It was as if the entire population had been relieved from an awful strain. More like it was a perfect breeding ground for a viral pandemic that the city had only recently recovered from. Also on that day, an editorial appeared concerning lemons. Prices for the fruit, touted for its benefits against the deadly influenza germs, had gone from 12 cents per dozen to 50 cents. Demand for lemons was high, creating a shortage of them in the market. It was pointed out that the Federal Trade Commission regulated the profits for oranges, and the article wondered why the same rules did not apply to the more in-demand lemons during the epidemic. Friday, November 8th. More news appeared about the previous day's gathering of the populace in a steadily increasing rain. Festivities went on past sundown with, quote, the street crowding multitude, in what finally became a drenching rain. The article closed with this very prescient statement. The only anxiety is that some may have become so saturated and chilled, pneumonia results will develop. The beacon further noted, danger of influenza or pneumonia as a result of exposure held no terrors yesterday afternoon and evening. Monday, November 11th. At 6 a.m. Eastern Time, news arrived that the war was truly over. Within half an hour, Mayor James E. Harley issued a proclamation closing schools, stores, and factories by noon for a real celebration this time around. A massive parade set off at 2 o'clock p.m., and the city assembled en masse until after midnight. The Victory Parade, quote, was the largest spectacle ever seen in Aurora. It was estimated that 10,000 people marched, and then add on the number of citizens that packed the route. The recent pandemic had clearly been placed on the back burner. Saturday, November 16th. 5 days later, the damage had been done, and new cases of the Spanish influenza were appearing. Health Inspector George B. Schwachkin issued a statement noting that few cases of influenza are developing into pneumonia, and in the main, the situation is encouraging. Conditions would not remain that way for long. Thursday, November 26th. Over at Mooseheart, 75 children were infected, and a call was put out for nurses to help with the situation. 2 people had already died there. Meanwhile, in Aurora, after a week of illness, the New England Congregational pastor, Reverend Harold Parr, succumbed to Spanish influenza, most likely caught after conducting a patriotic service 9 days earlier. At the funeral service held the next day, quote, the church was crowded with almost the entire congregation and friends from other churches to pay tribute to the little minister. Reverend Parr was only 32 years old. Sunday, December 1st. It was hoped that the situation at Mooseheart was under control, despite 300 of its 500 children having come down with influenza. Officials felt that only 1 or 2 of them were seriously ill. 50 trained nurses and 4 doctors were in attendance, as was the medical officer of the Mooseheart War Camp, now that the soldiers were sent home. 3 deaths had taken place. Tuesday, December 3rd, the state of Illinois issued an order for, quote, all Illinois health officers to begin immediate prosecution in all instances where regulations are being infracted. Actual or suspected cases of the Spanish influenza were to be reported, and those afflicted were required to isolate. After recovery, sufferers were to quarantine for 5 days after their temperature returned to normal. Dr. C. St. Clair Drake, director of the State Health Department, stated, unless we control the epidemic by the middle of January, when the pneumonia season begins, we can expect an appalling death rate. Sunday, December 8th, the Sunday edition of the Beacon featured an article from Rupert Blue, the Surgeon General in Washington, D.C., in which he stated, "The country need not fear that the influenza epidemic will return. It has run its course and gone for good." Despite what he termed sporadic outbreaks, he added that, like the poor, we have influenza always with us. Blue pointed out that in 1916, 19,000 flu deaths had occurred. The comparison of figures seemed very naive, considering that over 330,000 deaths had already taken place during the current pandemic. Just like today's crisis, Washington claimed to be on top of everything. Monday, December 9th. Despite Blue's rosy views, Schmachkin and other health department officials headed to Chicago for a meeting, quote, to discuss what further action shall be taken toward combating the flu situation, which is reported to be very bad again. Here in Aurora, there was an estimated number of 500 new infections, and, quote, several deaths occurred over the Sabbath. Quote, one undertaker was called on 4 cases between midnight and 6 o'clock this morning. The local hospitals were crowded with the flu and pneumonia cases, and it is impossible to employ nurses for cases which are being cared for in private homes. There's Tuesday, December 10th. That morning, the city's health department met to consider a host of issues facing the city. Losses to the local stores preparing for the Christmas season and to local amusement venues were debated. Quote, every pro and con was carefully balanced. It was hoped it wouldn't become necessary to institute another quarantine, quote, unless it became imperative. Schmachkin stated, the city must face the fact, should the spread of the influenza epidemic advance progressively, this ban would be put on. It would be complete. Saloons, amusement places, stores, everything. While the hospitals were filled almost to capacity, their real need was for more nurses. Should the facilities become too crowded, Schmachkin had the power to commandeer other places to handle patients. The West Side School Board, quote, approved closing the schools if necessary, but not unless restrictions were placed upon the entire town. It was expected that in a few days after consulting with Schmachkin, a ruling would be made on instructors and students being required to wear masks, which would be furnished by the Red Cross. Thursday, December 12th. Schmachkin attended another conference in Chicago and, quote, it was the consensus of opinion that the people should be given another chance to try to relieve the situation before closing things up. Schmachkin stated, if the people will exercise all precautions not to spread the disease further, and if the situation does not become worse, there will be no need to close things up here again. If not, then the ban must go on and on tight. Influenza and flu deaths in Aurora already numbered 40 victims in December. October flu deaths were at 130 and another 110 died in November. It was speculated that December mortality could be even higher. Dr. E.C. Rosenau of the Mayo Clinic developed a serum treatment that appeared to be effective against the virus. Quote, among the 20,000 cases that had been inoculated with the serum 3 times, only 1 case came down with the disease. Vaccinations were recommended, but Schmachkin was only able to get 2,000 treatments. Doctors were encouraged to get more of the serum from other sources. Friday, December 13th. An interview with Schmachkin confirmed 45 new influenza cases from the day before and another 25 on this date. The article included a letter written by the Aurora theater managers in anticipation of a second citywide ban. It was pointed out that the theaters had been very proactive throughout the pandemic, banning patrons with coughs and cold, posting signage both inside and outside their establishments telling people who were showing any flu-like symptoms to stay home. The theaters were showing informational slides about the epidemic before feature presentations, the premises were disinfected twice daily, and the managers touted the ventilation systems in each movie house. With all these safeguards, these businessmen contended that if they had to close their theaters, there should be no discrimination in a second ban. Everything, saloons, pool halls, stores, etc., should be closed as well. Saturday, December 14th. The Beacon informed the citizens of Aurora that Schmachkin was preparing to issue a second ban to take effect on Monday. The new regulations would be published in the Sunday paper. Sunday, December 15th. Quote, the progressive increase of influenza and pneumonia cases in Aurora had reached such a point yesterday that the local Board of Health deemed it wise to announce a second ban upon the entire city. to take effect Monday morning. This time around, saloons, pool halls, and bowling alleys were included in the order, but, quote, conferences led to a certain modification. All three venues could be open during the day, but they were required to close at 5 o'clock. Theaters, on the other hand, could not open until evening and could only sell tickets to half capacity. Only alternate rows were allowed for seating. Local shopkeepers were present at the conference, and some of them felt the orders to close early were nonsensical. Albert Hirsch of Hirsch, Riley, and Stewart was quoted saying, "I fail to see anything to be gained in closing the stores evenings, and our stores will certainly not be closed." The order was, as amended, ran to 4 full-page columns in the Beacon and stated, quote, "If all the preventable rules and regulations are strictly adhered to, we may avert the necessity of closing all businesses, stopping all trade, especially when it is so essential to keeping the arteries of progress open. Funerals were to be kept private and only clergy, undertakers, and immediate family in attendance. Flowers were only allowed at the cemetery." The streetcars were required to post signage against coughing, sneezing, and spitting, and for riders to cover the nose and mouth. Standards of heating, ventilation, and sanitation were mentioned, and no smoking was allowed. Overcrowding was discussed with the operators, and extra cars would be put into service. Businesses were subject to restrictions, and the ruling prohibited, quote, "all unnecessary public gatherings," this is to include churches, athletic meets, lodges, public weddings, clubs, banquets, lectures, conventions, social gatherings, and all other public assemblages. Loitering and congregating upon the streets will not be tolerated. Evening church services were forbidden, and daytime sessions were limited to 45 minutes. Seating was regulated to every other row of pews, and anyone with signs of illness was to be denied entry. Schools, it was felt, could remain open. Quote, "It would be possible to supervise children and keep many of them under better conditions during school hours than if they run the streets or play on the premises where persons sick with the disease were domiciled." Daily health inspections were required and inquiries made concerning any ill persons at home. Schools were to investigate absences to determine whether students could be potential carriers of the virus. Proper ventilation and sanitation were stressed, and there was to be no sharing of cups or towels. Any child who had the Spanish influenza was required to stay at home, quote, "at least 8 days from the first day of sickness, and only when the child is free from coughing, sneezing, discharging nose and throat." If the flu was in the household, students would not be allowed in the buildings and, quote, "must remain on their own premises to avoid any contact that could spread the disease to other children." Merchants were also ordered to inspect employees daily. Anyone showing symptoms, send them back home. Stores were required to keep clean and well ventilated. Numbers of shoppers were to be kept at a minimum, so no special sales were allowed. Cups and shared towels were banned here as well. All businesses, quote, "except drugstores and restaurants, must close promptly at 6 o'clock." In the factories, foremen were directed to conduct a sick call each morning and to send any questionable person to the company doctor. Foremen were required to post pertinent information about the virus that they could get from the health department. Inquiries were to be made about sickness in families and cause of absences. Ventilation and sanitation were to be explicitly maintained. Hospital regulations denied admittance to anyone living in a house where the infection was present, and every visitor was required to wear a mask where patients were present. Influenza cases were to be isolated, and all cases of the disease were to be reported to Schwachkin. Night schools were closed. Any person or business that handled food was ordered to send any infected employees back home. Strict isolation was expected for anyone with the Spanish influenza. Attendants were to be properly masked, and only those in attendance were allowed in the sick room. Once cured, sufferers were banned from any public gatherings, and they could not use the streetcars until fully recovered. Milk bottles were not allowed in a sick room, and they had to be boiled before returning to the dairy. Quote, "premises will not be placarded unless the health commissioner has evidence that the family refuses to comply with the above requirements, in which instance the house shall be placarded and placed under strict and absolute quarantine and labeled as a slacker in the eyes of the neighborhood." Schwachkin provided readers with some statistics about the Rosenau vaccine, and he urged, quote, "that every man, woman, and child immediately become inoculated against this plague." He closed his statement by saying, "I trust we will accomplish our purpose without having to resort to any mode of legal enforcement, but violators will immediately be prosecuted to the full extent of the law." In another article from the 15th, the Beacon lamented, quote, "no one more nearly comprehends the condition of a city than do those who are employed in getting out a daily newspaper, and particularly this is true in a city the size of Aurora, where the newspapers were newspaper workers have a personal acquaintance with the majority of the city's residents. Aurora is in the midst of a most distressing health condition, and it is most difficult to keep the corners of the mouth turned up. The article went on to discuss the dearth of nurses to fight the pandemic. Quote, nurses are at a premium, and it would seem that those who are well could cook light food and send it to homes where there is an illness and where there is no one to care for the afflicted. Every last woman who will volunteer to help is asked to send her name by mail or telephone to Mrs. T.J. Parker of the Aurora Women's Committee of the Council of National Defense. Monday, December 16th. A small article on page 2 of the Beacon talked about Wiley W. Stevens, who had survived 2 attacks of the Spanish influenza and who was now laid low with a 3rd bout. Bertha Rich Creek, a service liaison between the city's churches, was a new sufferer. When she reported at the hospital, there was no room available, and she was only admitted to St. Joseph's after agreeing to wait for a vacated room to be prepared. YWCA Secretary Carrie Proctor also contracted the virus, and she was admitted to the Aurora Hospital. A weekend of sunshine and warmer temperatures raised hopes that the situation in Aurora was on the mend, so the ban order was amended, allowing merchants, local amusements, and theaters to remain open for business as usual. Social gatherings were allowed, provided there was no overcrowding. Other changes showed that Swatchkin was walking back from placarding infected homes unless an honor quarantine was not observed. He stated, quote, if a worse situation comes and it is necessary to have a curative ban, we will close everything in the city except stores where groceries, meats, and drugs are sold in restaurants. This will mean that factories and all places of employment will be closed. It is up to the people to cooperate and help win this campaign against the disease. Mayor James E. Harley was now on the sick list with the virus. Another appeal for nurses appeared in which the local chapter of the American Red Cross called a meeting to seek solutions to the shortage. A consensus of those in attendance called for the Red Cross to turn their headquarters into a registration site for people who wanted to help. Schools in the city released staff nurses to fill this dire need. Quote, every woman who has any practical nursing training was asked to register. A letter was sent to Chicago asking for the loan of 3 nurses to provide additional training. Tuesday, December 17th, no new cases of influenza were being reported, which caused Schwatchkin to consider, quote, the situation much improved. He thought citizens were following doctors' orders better, and a continuation of the warmer weather was keeping the disease under control. In another article, the affiliated Aurora Germ Society met, and it was decided that members of the organization would attend any local dances in a body and pursue pernicious activities upon the dancers in attendance with united force. News of this decision reached Mayor James E. Harley, who banned all dances for the duration of the epidemic. A third article on December 17th informed readers that the City Council voted in favor of placarding homes where Spanish influenza was present. The signs were to be, quote, highly colored and conspicuous. Schwatchkin's opinion was that it will require a large force of men to placard all the houses where sick persons are. Figures quoted by Alderman Leonard Moss estimated there were between 800 to 1,000 cases of illness in Aurora at that time. Wednesday, December 18th, 3 men working under the direction of Dr. Schwatchkin began tagging infected homes on this day. It was estimated that it would take 3 weeks for them to finish the monumental task at hand without more help from the community. One doctor, J.W. McDonald, was quoted saying, quote, the government was so far not contributed 1 cent in helping stamp out this disease, which has already claimed 400,000 deaths in this country, 1% every 15 seconds dying. 67 new cases had been reported to the health commissioner the day before, and another 28 victims were recorded by noon. Commenting on the ban against dancing, Schwatchkin noted that one local dancing master has threatened to start legal action for interfering with his business. I invite such action if he wishes to start anything. Thursday, December 19th. Fewer cases were being reported, and improvements among those already afflicted created a sense that the health crisis was winding to a close. Quote, the cooperation by physicians and residents is a mighty factor in the campaign to stamp out the plague, said Schwatchkin. It was also pointed out that the volume of work involved with placarding infected homes was behind schedule, and in some cases it might be, quote, a few days before the house is quarantined. Friday, December 20th, Maintenance issues were limiting the available number of streetcars, and residents were critical of the sanitary condition of those cars still in service. The director of the streetcar company had fallen victim to the virus, so cleaning measures were not personally attended to, creating this situation. The article went on to state, even this daily attention, cleaning and flushing the cars, cannot offset the performance of the patrons of the porcine variety, who expectorate freely upon the floor or steam pipes as he peacefully rides along. Sunday, December 22nd, in a recap of the local flu situation, Shvachkin reported 560 people ill and, quote, the situation is greatly improved and most encouraging. On Saturday, another 18 cases were confirmed and 31 cases were received on Friday. 300 houses were now tagged with placards, and those attaching the signs found the residents, quote, accept the matter good-naturedly. The demand for cut flowers, both for funerals and for the Christmas season, had cleared all the area greenhouses. The few flowers still available were commanding premium prices, putting them out of reach for most buyers. Monday, December 23rd, quote, not only are volunteer nurses walking fearlessly into homes where influenza is rampant, but also into homes where people brandish hatchets. In the Peter Wagner home, Mrs. Wagner was sick, and an investigator was sent to the house to check on her condition. No one answered the door, yet children could be seen inside. Another nurse returned later, and she was greeted by the master of the house, who brandished a hatchet. Quote, it is now said that a hatchet is Wagner's favorite toy. Relatives have suggested that the Welfare Association take steps to make it impossible for him to get liquor. The Welfare Association told family members that this was a matter they needed to take care of. Thursday, December 26th, the ban was lifted from dancing yesterday in time to save the jazz-loving Aurorans from being sore at Santa Claus. Once the news became public, several dances took place the night before. Only 7 or 8 new cases of the disease were reported on Christmas Day. In one of these instances, the afflicted was taken sick, so suddenly he died before a nurse could be found. Monday, December 30th, Shvachkin expressed great confidence in saying the Spanish influenza crisis was well under control. The number of reported cases was dwindling, and most of those still sick were well on the way to recovery. Quarantine signs were being removed, and good results have been obtained from the use of Rosenau syndrome. Aurora residents were still urged to use caution to prevent further spread of the disease. Thursday, January 2nd, by this point, the number of Spanish flu cases in the city dropped to 250 people. All in all, an estimated 6,000 plus citizens have been affected by the 2 waves of the pandemic. Wednesday, January 8th, as the temperatures of January dropped, Shvachkin thought the virus was completely checked. While there was still some influenza cases in the city, the epidemic was over for the time being. But his opinion was that outbreaks would continue off and on all winter. The local doctors were finally getting some relief. One noted, quote, we are just reaching the point where we can snatch a few sleep hours now and then. Monday, January 13th, 8 additional cases of the Spanish influenza were reported that day. But this was a significant drop from the 50 reports per day during the height of the second wave of the pandemic. As soon as someone was diagnosed, the home was placarded and 30 residents were still subject to quarantine. Thursday, January 16th. For the first time since fall, no new cases of the virus were reported to the health commissioner the day before, and only 4 new infections were recorded on the 16th. Sunday, January 19th. The Beacon printed Shvachkin's report on the Spanish influenza's course in Aurora that would be sent to the State Health Department. Over 3,000 cases were recorded between October 1st and December 31. Another estimated 2,000 cases never made the roster. The actual tally of deaths for the entire run of the disease was 211 residents. The first person to contract the infection was Margaret Best on October 2nd, who later recovered. Figures showed that mortality was higher among men than women, with 117 males dying as opposed to 94 women. Shvachkin was very pleased by the results of the local vaccinations. Over 1,000 people received the shot with a 0 mortality rate among them. While some did end up getting a mild form of the virus, none of them came down with the more fatal pneumonia, which was the natural result of the disease. Sunday, January 26th. Shvachkin issued the figures that he compiled for his annual report to the City Council. The yearly death rate for 1918 was 1.9 per 1,000 residents, and there were 230 more fatalities than the year before. The sharp increase was entirely due to the Spanish influenza. The report listed 211 deaths for the run of the pandemic. However, this number does not tally with the figures given by Shvachkin on December 12th that indicated there were 130 influenza deaths in October, another 110 in November, and an additional 40 by that date in December. How do we explain the discrepancy? Were the numbers fudged, and which of the tallies is correct? Other infectious diseases for 1918 declined, and the health inspector concluded that, quote, people are taking better care of themselves because of the influenza scare. As for the current state of affairs in the city, Schwachkin stated, while there is still some influenza in the city, the condition is far better than it was. I believe that we will have some flu all winter, but if the public will be careful, we will probably get through without another epidemic. Outbreaks of Spanish influenza would continue to plague the world into 1920, but the measures taken to combat the first two waves of the pandemic seemed to keep the number of cases and fatalities checked. Many of the comments received since the first installment of the series appeared reflect the similarities between what took place 102 years ago and what is happening now. This goes to show how important an understanding of the past can be if we decide to learn from the mistakes that were made before. Thank you for joining us, and we'll hopefully see you soon.